Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you least expect it. For Marco Reyes, a struggling single father facing the possibility of losing custody of his daughter, that unexpected gift came in the form of a forgotten Spanish galleon. Rotting in the California desert, nobody wanted the old ship. It had been sitting there for decades, rusting away in the small town of Esperanza like some forgotten dream. Marco inherited it from a distant relative he barely knew, and most folks thought it was worthless junk. But when Marco and his 8-year-old daughter Isla started exploring the decaying vessel together, they found something incredible, hidden beneath centuries of sand and salt. What they discovered would change their lives forever and prove that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or silver, but the bonds we forge and the legends we choose to believe in. But what happens when a desperate father and his curious daughter stumble upon a secret that could change everything they thought they know about history itself? Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marco Reyes had always been most comfortable underwater, in the depths of the Pacific, where silence wrapped around him like an old friend. The weight of his failures couldn't follow. 20 years in the Navy had taught him that beneath the surface, problems looked different, smaller somehow, more manageable. But these days, even the ocean couldn't wash away the growing stack of overdue bills on his kitchen table, or the court papers that arrived with crushing regularity. At 38, Marco carried the weathered look of a man who'd spent most of his adult life diving in harsh conditions. His hands bore the permanent stains of salt water and machinery, and his dark eyes held the kind of careful observation that came from years of navigating underwater hazards. He'd been a master diver in the Navy, one of the best they'd ever trained. But civilian diving work in the small coastal town of Esperanza, California, barely paid enough to keep food on the table, let alone cover the mounting legal fees for his custody battle. Esperanza itself seemed caught between two worlds, the faded glamour of what it once hoped to become and the stubborn reality of what it was. Founded in the 1920s as a would-be resort destination, the town had peaked briefly in the 1950s before the interstate highway bypassed it entirely. Now, with a population hovering just under 3,000, it survived on a combination of fishing, farming, and the occasional tourist who took the wrong exit and decided to stay for lunch. The town's main street still held traces of its optimistic past. Art Deco facades on the old movie theater and bank building hinted at grander aspirations, while hand-painted signs for family businesses spoke of generations who'd chosen to stay despite better opportunities elsewhere. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where bad news traveled faster than good, and where a single father struggling to make ends meet could still count on his neighbors for a helping hand. Marco's daughter Isla was the bright spot in his increasingly complicated world. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of boundless curiosity that could turn a trip to the grocery store into an archaeological expedition. She collected interesting rocks, named every stray cat in their neighborhood, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of marine biology that impressed even her father's diving buddies. Isla had inherited her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn determination, along with an imagination that could transform the most ordinary day into an adventure. "Dad, why do ships have names?" Isla asked one evening as they shared a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. She was curled up in the oversized armchair that dominated their small living room, her legs tucked under her like a cat. "Well, mija," Marco said, using the Spanish endearment his own father had favored, "sailors believe ships have souls. Naming them shows respect, like making a friend. Do all ships have good souls?" Marco paused, considering his words carefully. Isla's questions often carried more weight than their simple phrasing suggested. "I think most do, but like people, some ships carry heavy stories. Some have seen more sorrow than joy." This conversation had taken place 3 days before the lawyers. Letter arrived, the one that would change everything. The letter came from a firm in San Diego, written in the kind of formal language that made simple things sound impossible. It informed Marco that his great-uncle Tomas, whom he remembered meeting only once as a child, had passed away and left him something in his will. The something turned out to be a ship, not just any ship, but a Spanish galleon that had somehow ended up landlocked in the desert outside Esperanza, about 5 miles from the nearest water. According to the letter, the ship had been sitting there for decades, originally part of a failed theme restaurant from the 1960s. The restaurant had closed after only 2 years, and the ship had been slowly deteriorating ever since. Marco's first reaction had been to laugh. His second was to worry about the taxes and maintenance costs. His third, after seeing Isla's eyes light up with pure wonder when he told her about it, was to drive out to take a look. The ship sat in a small valley between 2 low hills, surrounded by scrub brush and cactus. From a distance, it looked like a mirage, this massive wooden vessel rising from the desert floor as if it had sailed across sand dunes instead of ocean waves. Up close, the illusion became even more surreal. The galleon was enormous, easily 150 feet from bow to stern, with 3 towering masts that reached toward the desert sky like the fingers of some sleeping giant. Her hull was painted in faded blues and golds, though years of sun and wind had weathered the colors to muted pastels. Elaborate carvings decorated her stern, and a figurehead in the shape of a woman with flowing hair pointed toward the distant mountains. "She's beautiful," Isla breathed, pressing her small hand against the weathered hull. Marco had to admit there was something majestic about the old vessel, even in her current state. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had built her had been a master of their trade. Despite decades of neglect, the basic structure appeared sound. The desert climate had actually preserved much of the wood that would have rotted away. In a more humid environment, an older man emerged from a small trailer parked nearby. He was probably in his 70s, with skin like leather and eyes the color of faded denim. He wore work clothes that had seen better decades and a hat that looked older than Marco. "You must be Tomas's nephew," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Name's Luis Herrera. I've been keeping an eye on her for the past few years, making sure kids don't vandalize her too badly." "I appreciate that," Marco said. "I'm Marco, and this is my daughter Isla." "Beautiful name," Luis said to Isla, who beamed at the compliment. "It means island, doesn't it?" "Dad says I'm his island of calm in a stormy sea," Isla replied, then immediately began pelting Luis with questions about the ship. Where did it come from? How did it get here? Was it a real pirate ship? Luis chuckled, settling into what was clearly a familiar role as the ship's unofficial historian. "Well, little island, that's a longer story than most people want to hear. Your great-uncle Tomas bought her from a movie studio back in 1963. She was built for some adventure film that never got finished, but the construction was authentic, real, Spanish galleon design, built with traditional methods. But how did she get here?" Isla persisted. That's where it gets interesting. The fellow who commissioned her, a man named Rodriguez, claimed she was built from the plans of a real ship that sailed these waters 300 years ago. Said he had documentation proving it. Most folks thought he was spinning tales to drum up business for his restaurant, but Tomas believed there might be something to it. Marco found himself studying the ship with new interest. Even to his experienced eye, there were details that seemed oddly authentic. The wear patterns on the deck planking, the way certain joints were cut, the placement of hardware, it all spoke of genuine maritime use, not Hollywood set decoration. "Your uncle spent years researching her history," Luis continued, "had boxes of papers, old maps, ship manifests. Never could prove anything definitive, but he was convinced she had secrets to tell. As if summoned by the word secrets, Isla was already climbing the wooden ladder that led to the ship's deck. Marco started to call her back, then thought better of it. The rungs looked solid enough, and Isla was an agile climber. "The deck's safe," Luis assured him. "I check it regularly. Some of the lower areas might be questionable, but the main deck and upper structures are solid." Marco followed his daughter up the ladder, emerging onto a deck that took his breath away. From this height, the ship felt enormous. The main deck stretched out before them, punctuated by the massive mainmast and flanked by weathered but intact railings. Coils of rope that had turned grey with age lay neatly arranged, as if the crew had just finished their duties for the day. Isla was already at the ship's wheel, her small hands gripping the worn wooden spokes as she pretended to navigate across. Desert seas. "Dad, look, I can see the whole valley from here." From the ship's deck, Esperanza looked different, smaller and more peaceful, nestled between hills that rolled away toward the distant ocean. Marco could see why someone might have chosen this spot for a restaurant. There was something romantic about the idea of dining aboard a ship that sailed through landscapes instead of seascapes. "She's got good bones," Luis said, joining them. On deck, "Your uncle always said that if someone had the time and money, they could restore her to something spectacular. Course, he never had either one." Marco walked the length of the deck, his experienced eye cataloguing what he saw. The mainmast was solid, though it would need new rigging. The deck planking was weathered but structurally sound. Most of the hardware was still in place, though it would all need cleaning and restoration. The cabin structures looked intact from the outside, though he'd need to explore them more thoroughly to assess their condition. "Has anyone ever been inside the cabins?" he asked. "Oh, sure, plenty of times over the years. Kids mostly looking for treasure." Luis grinned. "Never found anything more valuable than some old bottles and a few pieces of costume jewelry left over from the restaurant days. Your uncle went through every inch of her when he first inherited her from Rodriguez's estate. Said if there were any real treasures aboard, they were well hidden." As the afternoon sun began to slant lower across the desert, Marco found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about the ship that called to him, not just her beauty or her mystery, but the sense of possibility she represented. Here was something solid, something with history and character, something that could become whatever he and Isla chose to make of it. "What do you think, Mija?" he asked, as they prepared to climb down from the deck. "Too crazy to take on a project like this?" Isla looked at him with the kind of serious expression that sometimes made her seem far older than her 8 years. "Dad, remember what you always say about the best treasures being the ones nobody else wants?" Marco smiled. He'd been teaching her that lesson since she was old enough to beachcomb with him, explaining that the most interesting shells and stones were often overlooked by people who only searched for the obvious prizes. "I remember. Well, nobody wants this ship right now. That makes her perfect for us." As they drove back toward town that evening, Marco felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The ship represented challenges he couldn't even begin to calculate, expenses he couldn't afford, and time he didn't have. But it also represented something else, a chance to give Isla a summer she'd never forget, a project they could tackle together, and maybe, just maybe, an opportunity to change their circumstances in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The weathered ship's bell, hanging silent near the mainmast, would be the first thing they'd investigate more closely on their next visit. Luis had mentioned that it bore an inscription, though he'd never been able to make out all the words. Something about it had caught Marco's attention, the way the metal seemed to gleam, even under layers of patina, as if it were waiting for the right moment to ring again. That night, as Isla fell asleep clutching a library book about Spanish explorers, Marco sat at his kitchen table, staring at the legal papers for his custody hearing. 2 months. That's how long he had to prove he could provide Isla with stability, security, and a future worth believing in. Perhaps, he thought as he looked out his window toward the hills where the ship waited in the darkness, the answer to his prayers had been sitting in the desert all along. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official, bearing the seal of the San Bernardino County Family Court. Marco knew what it contained before he opened it, but the words still hit him like a physical blow. Custody hearing scheduled October 15th. 60 days. He had 60 days to prove to a judge that he could provide Isla with the stability and security that his ex-wife Sarah claimed he couldn't offer. 60 days to demonstrate that his irregular income as a freelance diver, their modest apartment, and his unconventional lifestyle were somehow better than the suburban certainty Sarah could provide with her new husband in their planned community outside Phoenix. Marco set the letter down, with hands that trembled slightly. Through the kitchen window, he could see Isla in their small backyard, carefully tending to the herb garden they'd planted together in repurposed diving equipment containers. She was humming to herself, completely absorbed in checking each plant for signs of new growth, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that their time together might be measured in weeks rather than years? The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. It was Jim Castellanos, his most reliable client, calling to cancel their scheduled dive job. "I'm sorry, Marco. The insurance company is dragging their feet on the claim. Could be another month before they approve the salvage work." Another month, another source of income vanishing just when he needed it most. Marco thanked Jim and hung up, staring at the legal papers as if they might change through force of will alone. That afternoon, as they drove out to visit the ship again, Isla sensed his mood, despite his efforts to hide it. "Dad, you're doing that thing where you grip the steering wheel too tight," she observed from the passenger seat. "Are you worried about something?" Marco glanced at his hands and consciously relaxed his grip. "Just thinking, Mika. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated thoughts that take a while to sort out. Mom used to say that when she was upset about something." The mention of Sarah sent a familiar pang through Marco's chest. He and Sarah had been high school sweethearts who'd married young, before either of them truly knew who they were or what they wanted from life. The marriage had survived his military deployments and the early years of fatherhood, but it hadn't survived the transition to civilian life and the financial pressures that came with it. "Your mum's a smart woman," Marco said carefully. "She wants what's best for you." "I know, but I like living with you. You let me ask questions about everything, and you never tell me something is too complicated for little girls." Marco's heart clenched. In 60 days, those daily conversations might become weekend phone calls and supervised visits. They found Luis waiting by the ship with a thermos of coffee and what looked like genuine excitement on his weathered face. "Been thinking about what you said yesterday," Luis told Marco as they climbed aboard, "about how the ship seems too authentic for a movie prop. Got me curious enough to do some digging through your uncle's papers." He produced a manila folder, thick with documents. Tomas kept everything: bills of sale, construction records, correspondence with the fellow who commissioned her. "But look at this." Luis handed Marco a faded photograph showing the ship in what appeared to be its original location, but the background was wrong. Instead of the desert valley where it now sat, the image showed the galleon surrounded by water, not ocean, but what looked like a large artificial lagoon. That's from 1963, right after Rodriguez moved her here. According to the records, he had that lagoon dug special, said the ship needed to be properly situated for the grand opening. Cost him a fortune, but he insisted it was essential. Isla studied the photograph with intense concentration. "Dad, look at the water. It's not deep enough to float a ship this big. The bottom of the hull is sitting on something." She was right. Even in the photograph, it was clear the ship wasn't floating freely, but resting on some kind of support structure beneath the shallow water. "Rodriguez filled in the lagoon after only 2 years," Luis continued. "Said it was too expensive to maintain, but your uncle always wondered if there wasn't another reason." "What kind of reason?" Marco asked, though something in Luis's tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "Well, folks said Rodriguez started acting strange toward the end, talking about voices from the ship, lights that shouldn't be there, equipment that worked when it should have been broken. Of course, he was under a lot of financial pressure by then. Stress can make a man imagine things." Isla had wandered toward the ship's stern while the adults talked, and now she called out with excitement, "Dad, there's a door back here that's different from the others." Marco and Luis followed her voice to where she stood examining what appeared to be a service hatch near the ship's waterline. Unlike the other access points they'd explored, this one seemed to have been sealed, not with the casual boarding up of abandoned spaces, but with deliberate, careful work. "I've never noticed that before," Luis admitted, running his hands over the sealed edges. "The wood looks different here. Newer, somehow." Marco knelt beside his daughter, studying the hatch with the methodical attention of someone trained to spot underwater hazards. The seal work was professional grade, designed to be both watertight and permanent. More interesting, the wood used for the sealing had been carefully matched to the ship's original planking and artificially aged to blend seamlessly. "Someone really didn't want this opened," he murmured. "Can we open it?" Isla asked, bouncing slightly with anticipation. Marco looked at Luis, who shrugged. "She's your ship now. If you want to see what's behind it, I've got some tools in my truck." It took the better part of an hour to carefully remove the sealed hatch without damaging the surrounding structure. As the last piece came free, a rush of air escaped that carried the strangest scent, not the mustiness Marco expected, but something that reminded him of old books and sea spray, as if the space beyond had been preserved in time. Marco shone. His flashlight through the opening, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the ship's hull. Unlike the areas they'd explored before, this space showed no signs of decay or neglect. The wooden walls gleamed as if they'd been recently oiled, and brass fittings reflected the flashlight beam without a trace of corrosion. "This doesn't make sense," he said, more to himself than to the others. "This area should be in worse condition than the upper decks, not better." Isla was already squeezing through the opening, her small size allowing her to navigate the narrow passage with ease. "Dad, you have to see this." Against his better judgment, a voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Sarah, Marco followed his daughter into the hidden space. The passage opened into a chamber that defied everything he thought he knew about the ship's construction. The room was circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that seemed to be made of some kind of dark wood inlaid with metal designs. But it was what sat in the center of the room that made Marco's breath catch in his throat. A desk. An enormous, ornate desk, carved from what looked like a single piece of ebony, its surface covered with charts, instruments, and an open book. Not replicas or movie props, but genuine artifacts that looked as if they'd been placed there yesterday. Isla was already at the desk, her fingers hovering just above the open book. "Dad, look at the writing. It's in Spanish, but the date says 1712. Marco approached the desk with the careful movements of someone who understood he might be looking at something irreplaceable. The book was a ship's log, written in an elegant hand with ink that still looked wet. The pages were filled with detailed observations, navigation notes, weather reports, and what appeared to be scientific observations of sea life and ocean currents. But it was the name written on the inside cover that made Marco's hands shake. As he held his flashlight steady, Captain Alejandro Meridia, San Esperanza, year of our Lord, 1712. "San Esperanza!" Luis breathed from behind them. "That's the old Spanish name for this area before it was called Esperanza, but there's no record of any Spanish settlements here that early." Isla was studying a chart spread across the desk, her young mind processing details that escaped the adults. "This map shows the coastline, but it's wrong. Look, here's where our town should be, but the map shows a deep bay where there's dry land now." She was right again. The chart depicted the local geography with startling accuracy, except that it showed a large natural harbor exactly where Esperanza now sat, miles inland from the current coast. Marco found himself staring at a leather-bound journal that lay open beside the ship's log. The entries were more personal, written in the same elegant Spanish, but interspersed with diagrams and calculations that looked more like advanced mathematics than maritime observations. "Luis," he said slowly, "you mentioned that Rodriguez acted strangely toward the end. Do you remember what specifically he claimed to see or hear?" The older man thought for a moment. "He said the ship's bell would ring on still nights when there wasn't any wind. Said he found navigation equipment working that had been broken for years. Toward the end, he claimed he could hear voices speaking Spanish in the lower decks, having conversations about things that happened centuries ago. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted through the ship's hull, the deep, resonant toll of a bronze bell. Marco felt the hair on his arms rise as the sound echoed through the chamber, impossibly rich and clear. Isla looked up from the journal with eyes that sparkled with excitement rather than fear. "The ship wants us to find her secrets, Dad. She's been waiting all this time for someone who would really listen." Marco knew he should feel skeptical, scientific, rational. Instead, he felt the same certainty that had once guided him through dangerous underwater salvage operations, the intuitive. Understanding that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. The custody hearing was 60 days away. But sitting in this impossible chamber, surrounded by artifacts that shouldn't exist, Marco began to understand that the ship might offer more than just a summer project for him and Isla. It might offer them a future worth fighting for, the Esperanza. Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its rooms still divided into what had once been parlor, dining room and bedrooms. Rosa Martinez had been the head librarian for 37 years, long enough to watch 3 generations of local families grow up among her carefully tended shelves. She was a compact woman in her 70s, with steel-grey hair pulled back, in a practical bun, and eyes that missed nothing. When Marco and Isla arrived that Thursday morning, Rosa was cataloguing a donation of books at her desk. But she looked up with the kind of genuine smile that made visitors feel immediately welcome. "You must be Marco Reyes," she said, setting down her work. "I knew your great-uncle Tomas. He spent many hours in our history section researching that ship of his." "That's actually why we're here," Marco said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs Rosa kept for researchers. "We've been exploring the ship, and we've found some things that don't quite make sense." Rosa's expression sharpened with interest. She gestured for Isla to join her at a reading table covered with local history books. "Tell me what kind of things." Marco described the sealed chamber and the artifacts they'd discovered, carefully avoiding the more inexplicable details. Rosa listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Your uncle found similar inconsistencies," she said when Marco finished. "The ship's construction, the materials used, even the way certain joints were cut, everything suggested genuine historical maritime craftsmanship, not Hollywood reproduction." She disappeared into the stacks and returned with a box marked Herrera Donation, Local History. Inside were dozens of folders, photographs, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. This came from the estate of Carlos Herrera, Luis's older brother. Carlos was something of an amateur historian. He documented everything he could find about the early Spanish presence in this area. Rosa spread several photographs across the table. They showed the same coastline Marco had grown up seeing, but taken from angles that made familiar landmarks look strange and foreign. These were taken in 1962, during the lowest tides in recorded history, Rosa explained. "Look carefully at the waterline." Marco studied the images and felt his pulse quicken. In the photographs, the extremely low tide revealed what appeared to be stone foundations, extending far into what should have been deep water, regular geometric shapes that suggested deliberate construction. Carlos believed there was once a Spanish settlement here, much earlier than any official records indicate. He spent 40 years trying to prove it, but never found conclusive evidence. Isla had been quietly examining the photographs with the intense focus she brought to anything that captured her imagination. Mrs. Rosa, these stones in the water, they're arranged like the buildings in Old Town San Diego, aren't they? Like they were laid out around a central plaza? Rosa smiled at the observation. Very good, mija. Carlos thought the same thing. He believed the original settlement was built around a natural deep-water harbor that gradually filled in over time as the coastline changed. Marco found himself thinking of the chart they'd discovered in the ship's hidden chamber, the one that showed a large bay exactly where Esperanza now stood. Rosa, did Carlos ever find any documentation about Spanish ships visiting this area? In the early 1700s, fragments only, ship manifests that mentioned San Esperanza as a port of call, but no official recognition from colonial authorities. It was as if the place existed but wasn't supposed to exist. She produced another folder, this one filled with photocopies of documents in archival Spanish. Carlos found these in Mexico City archives. They reference a Captain Alejandro Meridia who allegedly made regular voyages to the Northern Sanctuary between 1710 and 1715. Marco's hands went still on the documents. Captain Alejandro Meridia, the same name they'd found in the ship's log. What happened to him? Marco asked, though something in Rosa's expression suggested the answer wouldn't be simple. That's where the story becomes strange. According to colonial records, Captain Meridia was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition for unnatural philosophy and commerce with forbidden knowledge. The charges were dropped after powerful friends intervened, but Meridia and his ship disappeared from all official records after 1715. Rosa paused, studying Marco's face. Your uncle believed that ship in the desert might be Meridia's vessel. Not a replica, not a reproduction, the actual ship. Isla looked up from a book she'd been browsing. If it's the real ship, then Captain Meridia's things would still be aboard, wouldn't they? All his instruments and maps and secrets? Theoretically, Rosa said carefully. But that would mean the ship somehow survived 300 years in near-perfect condition, which is essentially impossible. Marco thought of the preserved chamber, the charts that showed impossible geographical features, the brass instruments that gleamed without corrosion. Impossible seemed to be a relative concept where the ship was concerned. Mrs. Rosa, Isla said, do you have any books about old navigation instruments, especially Spanish ones from the 1700s? Rosa's eyes lit up. She clearly enjoyed working with young people who asked specific, intelligent questions. I have something even better. She led them to a glass display case near the library's entrance. Inside, among other local artifacts, sat a brass instrument that made Marco's breath catch. It was an astrolabe, a navigation device used to determine position based on celestial observations. But this one was different from any he'd seen in maritime museums. Where a normal astrolabe would have standard constellation markers, this one showed star patterns that Marco didn't recognize. The brass disc was covered with intricate engravings that seemed to shimmer in the display case lighting, and there were additional markings around the rim that looked more like mathematical equations than navigational notations. This was found in Carlos Herrera's house after he died, Rosa explained. No one knows where he got it, but the craftsmanship suggests it's genuinely old. The star patterns don't match any known constellations, though. Isla pressed her face close to the glass, studying the instrument with fascination. Dad, the symbols around the edge, they look like some of the markings we saw on the charts in the ship. Marco leaned in for a closer look and felt a chill of recognition. The mathematical notations were nearly identical to some of the calculations they'd glimpsed in Captain Meridia's journal. Rosa, is there any way we could examine this more closely? Maybe photograph the markings? Rosa considered this. Under normal circumstances, I'd have to say no. But given your family connection to the ship and Tomas's years of research here, I think we could make an exception. She unlocked the display case and carefully lifted out the astrolabe. Up close, the instrument was even more remarkable. The brass seemed to warm under their hands, and the engravings appeared to have a depth that suggested they weren't simply etched on the surface, but somehow integral to the metal itself. "There's something else unusual about it," Rosa said. "Sometimes, especially on clear nights, visitors claim they can see it glowing faintly. The night security guard swears it happens, but I've never witnessed it myself." As if responding to her words, the astrolabe seemed to pulse with the faintest golden light. Marco blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him, but Isla gasped softly. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's like it's alive." Rosa stared at the instrument with new respect. "In all the years it's been here, I've never seen it do that during daylight hours." Marco carefully photographed the astrolabe from multiple angles, capturing both the overall design and close-up details of the mysterious markings. As he worked, he found himself thinking about patterns, the way the ship's artifacts seemed to be revealing themselves in a specific sequence, as if each discovery was preparing them for the next revelation. "Rosa," he said, as they prepared to leave, "did Carlos Herrera ever mention finding other artifacts, things that might be connected to Captain Meridia or the ship?" Rosa smiled mysteriously. Carlos was a careful man. He believed that some discoveries were too important to be displayed publicly until the right person came along to understand them. He left specific instructions about certain items in his collection. She handed Marco a business card with a local address. "That's where Luis lives now, in his brother's old house. If Carlos left anything for safekeeping, Luis would know about it." As they walked back to their car, Isla skipped alongside her father with obvious excitement. "Dad, it's like we're following a treasure map, except the treasure is leaving clues for us to find." Marco had to admit that's exactly what it felt like. Each new discovery seemed to fit perfectly with what they'd found before, creating a picture that was becoming clearer with each piece they uncovered. "What do you think, Mija? Should we go visit Luis and see what else Carlos might have found?" Isla grinned up at him. "Absolutely, but first, can we go back to the ship? I want to compare the astrolabe markings to those charts we saw. I have a feeling they're going to match perfectly." Marco suspected she was right. The ship seemed to be teaching them its secrets in carefully measured steps, and they were apparently ready for the next lesson. The compass room of the ship was located just below the main deck, accessible through a hatch near the wheel. Marco had noticed it during their initial explorations, but hadn't spent much time there. It seemed to be just another empty chamber with the standard nautical fixtures one would expect. That assumption proved to be completely wrong. When they descended into the compass room that afternoon, carrying Rosa's photographs of the astrolabe for comparison, Isla immediately noticed something different. "Dad, there's light coming from somewhere, but I don't see any windows." She was right. The chamber was illuminated by a soft golden glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As Marco's eyes adjusted, he could see that the light was coming from inlaid designs in the wood, spirals and geometric patterns that pulsed gently like a slow heartbeat. "This wasn't like this before," he said. Though even as he spoke, he wondered if they'd simply never been in the room at the right time of day to notice the phenomenon. Isla was drawn to the center of the room, where what Marco had assumed was a standard ship's compass turned out to be something far more extraordinary. The compass housing was larger than normal, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, and instead of a simple magnetic needle, it contained what appeared to be a sphere of crystalline material that floated freely in the center of a ring of brass instruments. "It's gorgeous," Isla breathed, reaching toward the crystal before Marco could stop her. The moment her fingers made contact with the crystal sphere, the entire compass mechanism came to life. The sphere began to glow with the same golden light as the walls, and the brass instruments around it started to move, not randomly, but with the precise coordination of clockwork. Most remarkably, the crystal itself began to emit a soft musical tone that seemed to resonate through the ship's hull. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like the song of some celestial choir, and it made Marco's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Isla, don't," he started, but she looked back at him with such wonder and peace on her face that he couldn't bring himself to tell her to let go. "Dad, it's not scary. It feels like it recognizes me, like it's been waiting for us to find it." The crystalline navigation stone, for that's what Marco realized it had to be, continued to sing and glow as Isla held it. Around the room, previously invisible markings became visible on the walls, revealing charts and calculations that covered every available surface. Marco compared the photographs from Rosa's astrolabe to the newly revealed wall markings and felt his pulse quicken. Not only did they match, but the wall charts seemed to be an expanded version of the astrolabe's calculations, showing mathematical relationships and navigational principles that were centuries ahead of their time. "This is impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to Isla. Navigation techniques this sophisticated weren't developed until the 20th century. A new voice spoke from the compass room entrance, making both Marco and Isla jump. "Actually, they were developed in 1712. We just forgot how to use them." Marco spun around to find a woman standing at the top of the ladder, someone he'd never seen before, but who looked completely at ease aboard the ship. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of deep tan that spoke of years spent outdoors. Her clothes were field-appropriate khakis and a work shirt, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, climbing down into the compass room. "Maritime historian from UC San Diego. I've been trying to reach you for several days." Marco instinctively moved closer to Isla, who was still holding the glowing crystal. "How did you find us here?" "Luis Herrera called me. He's been corresponding with my research group for several years about this ship. When he described what you'd been finding, I caught the first flight north." Dr. Vasquez's attention was entirely focused on the crystalline navigation stone. "May I ask how long that's been glowing?" "Since Isla touched it about 2 minutes ago," Marco said. "Dr. Vasquez, what do you know about this ship?" "More than I wish I did," she replied cryptically. "And apparently less than I need to." She gestured toward the crystal. "That device shouldn't exist. According to every historical record, Captain Alejandro Meridia's revolutionary navigation system was lost when his ship disappeared in 1715. "You know about Captain Meridia?" Dr. Vasquez smiled grimly. "I've been researching him for 15 years. My doctoral dissertation was on lost maritime technologies of the Spanish colonial period. Meridia was my primary subject." She moved carefully around the compass room, examining the wall charts with professional fascination. He was considered one of the greatest navigators of his era, but also one of the most controversial. Colonial authorities suspected him of using unnatural methods to achieve impossible accuracy in his voyages. Isla finally released the crystal, though it continued to glow softly. "What kind of unnatural methods?" "That's the mystery. Meridia's ships could navigate in weather that kept other vessels in port. He could find currents that didn't appear on any charts, predict tidal changes weeks in advance, and make voyages that should have been impossible with period technology." Dr. Vasquez pointed to one of the wall charts, which showed what appeared to be a three-dimensional representation of ocean currents. "This particular diagram describes deep-water thermal layers that weren't officially discovered until the 1950s. Yet here it is, drawn in 1712 with mathematical precision." Marco studied the chart she indicated. How could someone have that kind of knowledge 3 centuries before the technology existed to gather the data? That's what I've been trying to figure out. Some historians believe Meridia had access to information from an even earlier source, possibly pre-Columbian navigational knowledge that was preserved by indigenous peoples and shared with select Spanish explorers. "And what do you believe?" Dr. Vasquez looked around the compass room, taking in the impossible preservation, the functioning artifacts, and the crystal that continued to emit its ethereal glow. Until about 10 minutes ago, I believed Meridia was simply an exceptionally skilled navigator who used conventional methods more effectively than his contemporaries. Now I'm not sure what I believe. The sound of footsteps on the deck above announced Luis's arrival. He called down to them, his voice echoing through the compass room. "Elena, you found them. Marco, I brought those documents you asked about." As they climbed back to the main deck, Marco noticed that the ship's bell, the first artifact they discovered, was glowing with the same golden light as the crystal. The inscription around its rim, which had been barely visible before, now stood out clearly in elegant Spanish script. "San Esperanza, guardian de los secretos perdidos," Dr. Vasquez read aloud. "Guardian of lost secrets." That's quite a responsibility for a ship's bell. Luis spread several folders on a makeshift table created from a wooden crate. These are the documents Carlos left with specific instructions. He said they should only be shared with those who could make the ship sing. He gestured toward the compass room, from which the crystal's musical tone was still faintly audible. "I'd say that qualifies." The first folder contained photographs of artifacts that Carlos had apparently discovered over the years but never displayed publicly. Marco recognized several items from the ship's hidden chamber, but there were others that they hadn't yet found. Navigational instruments, charts showing impossible geographical features, and what appeared to be detailed drawings of mechanical devices that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Carlos spent 30 years documenting everything he could find about Captain Meridia, Luis explained. Toward the end of his life, he became convinced that Meridia hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been deliberately erased from history. Dr. Vasquez looked up from the photographs. Erased by whom? By people who were afraid of what his discoveries meant. Carlos believed that Meridia had access to knowledge that could have changed the course of history, navigation techniques that could have opened new trade routes, scientific principles that could have advanced human understanding by centuries. Isla, who had been quietly studying the photographs, suddenly pointed to one image. "That's here, on the ship. I recognize the carved symbols around the doorway." The photograph showed what appeared to be an elaborate laboratory or workshop, filled with instruments and mechanical devices that defied easy categorization. Marco could indeed see the distinctive carved symbols that decorated several doorways on the ship. "Where, Mija?" "Below the compass room. There's a door I noticed earlier, but it was too dark to see much. If we bring better lights tomorrow, I bet we could find it." Dr. Vasquez and Luis exchanged glances. "Marco," Dr. Vasquez said carefully, "I think you should know that this ship is about to attract a great deal of attention. Word of your discoveries is already spreading through academic circles. By next week, you'll probably have historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters knocking on your door." Marco felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when the custody papers arrived. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you need to decide what you want to do with what you found, because once the word gets out officially, decisions about this ship may no longer be entirely yours to make." As if summoned by her words, Marco's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but when he answered, the voice belonged to his ex-wife, Sarah. "Marco, I just got the strangest call from some reporter asking about a treasure ship you supposedly inherited. Please tell me you haven't dragged Isla into another one of your impractical schemes." Marco looked around at the glowing artifacts, the impossible preservation, and the faces of people who were beginning to believe in something extraordinary. "It's not a scheme, Sarah. It's an opportunity." "For what? To fill our daughter's head with more of your romantic nonsense about adventures and discoveries? Marco, she needs stability, not fantasies." After he hung up, the silence on the ship's deck felt heavy with unspoken concerns. Dr. Vasquez was the first to speak. "Marco, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, I'll support it. This discovery is too important to be influenced by people who can't understand its significance. Isla slipped her hand into his. Dad, remember what you taught me about the most valuable treasures. They're the ones other people overlook. Marco squeezed his daughter's hand and looked out at the desert landscape that stretched toward the distant ocean. I remember, Mija, but sometimes when other people finally notice those treasures, protecting them becomes more complicated than finding them. Dr. Vasquez returned 3 days later with a small research team and equipment that transformed the ship into something resembling an archaeological dig. Ground-penetrating radar, precision cameras, and analysis tools that Marco couldn't begin to identify were carefully transported aboard and arranged throughout the various chambers they'd discovered. The university approved emergency funding for a preliminary assessment, Dr. Vasquez explained as her team worked. What we've documented so far is unprecedented in maritime archaeology. Marco watched the controlled chaos of scientific investigation with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was fascinated to see professionals confirm what he and Isla had suspected, that the ship contained genuinely historical artifacts in impossible states of preservation. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was being lost in the process of turning their discoveries into academic data. Isla seemed to share his ambivalence. She followed the researchers around the ship, asking intelligent questions and offering observations, but Marco noticed that she avoided touching any of the artifacts when the scientists were present. It was as if she understood that the ship's mysteries required a different kind of interaction than scientific analysis could provide. The team's first major discovery came in the ship's navigation room, where they found what Dr. Vasquez identified as a mechanical star chart calculator. The device occupied an entire wall of the chamber, consisting of dozens of brass gears, dials, and calibrated instruments arranged in a complex pattern that resembled an enormous clock. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Vasquez breathed, photographing the mechanism from multiple angles. It appears to be designed to predict celestial events, eclipses, planetary alignments, tidal changes, centuries in advance. One of her graduate students, a young man named David, who specialized in historical mechanical engineering, was examining the gear ratios with obvious excitement. "Dr. Vasquez, the precision of this construction is incredible. Some of these gears have tooth counts that wouldn't be mathematically derived until the late 1800s. Marco found himself thinking of his conversation with Sarah and the accusations about filling Isla's head with fantasies. But as he watched credentialed scientists struggle to explain what they were seeing, he realized that reality was proving far more extraordinary than any fantasy he could have invented. "Dad?" Isla tugged at his sleeve. "Can I show you something? Away from the others?" Marco followed his daughter to a quiet section of the upper deck, where she produced a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I've been drawing the symbols I see around the ship," she said, unfolding what turned out to be a detailed sketch. "They're not random decorations. They tell a story." Marco studied his daughter's artwork with growing amazement. She had accurately reproduced dozens of carved symbols from various locations on the ship and arranged them in a sequence that did indeed suggest a narrative progression. "See?" Isla pointed to the first series of symbols. "These show a man with instruments studying the stars. Then these show him building something, the navigation devices, I think. And these at the end show him hiding everything away, like he was protecting it for the future. Mija, this is incredible work. Have you shown Dr. Vasquez?" Isla shook her head. "She's nice, but she looks at everything like it's broken and needs to be fixed. The ship isn't broken, Dad. It's just waiting." Before Marco could ask what she meant, David appeared at the top of the ladder leading to the navigation room. "Dr. Vasquez needs you both to see this," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "We've figured out how to activate the star chart calculator They found Dr. Vasquez and her team gathered around the mechanical device, which was now humming softly with the same golden energy they'd observed in the compass room. The brass gears were turning slowly, and dials across the mechanisms. Surface were displaying information in a combination of numbers and symbols. "Watch this," Dr. Vasquez said, adjusting one of the input dials. "If I set the date to today's date and ask for solar eclipse predictions, the machine calculates the next occurrence as August 12, 2045. I checked against NASA's eclipse database. It's accurate to within hours." She changed the settings again. "Lunar eclipse, same starting date, March 14th, 2025. Again, perfectly accurate." Marco was impressed, but Isla seemed troubled by the demonstration. "Dr. Vasquez, did you ask the machine what it wanted to show you? Or did you just tell it what to calculate?" The question seemed to catch the historian off guard. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "Well, Captain Meridia built this to help him navigate, right? So maybe it's designed to tell us something specific, not just answer random questions." Dr. Vasquez considered this. "You might have a point. David, try setting it to the ship's construction date, 1712, and see what it calculates on its own." David made the adjustment, and the machine's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of the steady, methodical calculations they'd observed before, the gears began spinning rapidly, while the dials displayed a complex sequence of measurements and coordinates. "It's showing multiple dates," David reported, reading from various displays. "October 15th, 1712, March 3rd, 1713, September 21st, 1715, and there are geographical coordinates for each date." Marco felt a chill of recognition. "October 15th, that's the date of my custody hearing." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her notes. "That's probably a coincidence, Marco. The machine is calculating based on historical astronomical data. But Isla was studying the coordinate displays with the same intense focus she'd brought to the symbol drawings. "These coordinates, do they show specific locations?" David checked his reference materials. "The first set corresponds to this exact location where the ship now sits. The second set shows a position about 10 miles south of here, near the coast. The third..." He paused, double-checking his calculations. "The third set doesn't correspond to any landmass. It's showing open ocean, roughly 50 miles west of here. But that's where the deep water trench runs," Marco said. "I've dived those waters. There's nothing there but seafloor." The star chart calculator continued its calculations, but now it was also producing what appeared to be detailed navigation charts on a paper-like material that emerged from a slot near its base. The charts showed coastline features, depth soundings, and current patterns with a level of detail that Marco recognized as masterwork cartography. "Dr. Vasquez," Isla said quietly, "I think Captain Meridia is trying to tell us something about those dates and locations, like they're important to understanding why he hid the ship." As if responding to her words, the machine suddenly stopped its frantic calculations and settled into a new pattern of movement. The main display now showed a single date, October 15th, 2025, along with coordinates that precisely matched the ship's current location. The team stood in stunned silence as the implications sank in. The machine wasn't just predicting celestial events. It was somehow calculating the significance of specific dates and locations across centuries. "This is impossible," David muttered, but his voice carried more wonder than skepticism. Dr. Vasquez was making rapid notes, her scientific training warring with what she was witnessing. "We need to document everything. If this device can accurately predict historical events, it represents a complete revolution in our understanding of both technology and temporal mechanics." Marco's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The sender was unfamiliar, but the message made his blood run cold. "We know about the ship. We know about the artifacts. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for exclusive access. Arrangements can be made to expedite your family situation if you're cooperative." He showed the message to Dr. Vasquez, whose expression darkened. Corporate interests, she said grimly. I was afraid this would happen. Word is spreading faster than we anticipated. What kind of corporate interests? The kind that see historical artifacts as commodities to be exploited rather than preserved. If they're already making veiled threats about your custody situation, they've done their research on your personal vulnerabilities. Isla had moved away from the group and was now standing near the ship's wheel, her small hands resting on the worn wooden spokes. Dad, the ship is getting nervous. There are too many people asking the wrong kinds of questions. Marco looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Her intuitive connection to the ship's mysteries was remarkable, but it was also pulling her deeper into a situation that was becoming increasingly complex and potentially dangerous. Mija, what do you think the right questions would be? Instead of asking what the ship can do for us, maybe we should ask what we can do for the ship. Captain Meridia spent years protecting these secrets. Maybe he's been waiting for people who would continue protecting them, instead of just using them. Dr. Vasquez overheard this observation and paused in her documentation. Isla, you may be onto something profound. In all my research about Meridia, the common thread was his fierce protectiveness of his discoveries. He consistently refused to share his methods with colonial authorities, even when threatened with investigation by the Inquisition. A new voice spoke from the ship's railing, making everyone turn in surprise. That's because he understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to be widely distributed without proper preparation. Standing at the top of the ladder was an elderly man Marco didn't recognize, someone in his 80s, with white hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of accumulated wisdom. He moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, but there was nothing frail about his presence. I'm Father Miguel Santos, the man said. I've been waiting 40 years for someone to find these artifacts. Now that you have, I believe it's time you understood exactly what you're dealing with. Father Miguel Santos moved around the ship with the familiarity of someone who had been aboard many times before. His weathered hands traced the carved railings with obvious affection, and when he spoke, it was with the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades considering his words carefully. Dr. Vasquez, your research is admirable, but it only tells part of Alejandro's story, he said, settling onto a wooden crate that Luis had positioned for him. The truth is more extraordinary and more dangerous than academic records suggest. Dr. Vasquez bristled slightly at the implied criticism. Father Santos, I've documented every available source about Captain Meridia over 15 years of research. What exactly are you suggesting I've missed? The sources that were deliberately hidden, the priest replied calmly. The documents that certain people wanted to ensure would never see the light of day. He reached into a worn leather satchel and withdrew several items wrapped in protective cloth. The first was a bound manuscript written in Latin, its pages yellowed with age, but still legible. This is Alejandro's personal journal, written in the last months before his disappearance. It was smuggled out of Spain by sympathetic monks who understood that his work represented something too important to be destroyed by fear and superstition. Marco leaned closer as Father Santos carefully opened the manuscript. The text was dense and complex, interspersed with detailed diagrams that showed mechanical devices and mathematical calculations. What does it say? Isla asked, peering at the ancient writing with fascination. It tells the story of a man who discovered that human understanding of the natural world was far more limited than anyone realized, Father Santos replied. Alejandro found evidence that there had been previous civilizations, much older than recorded history, that had achieved scientific understanding far beyond what we consider possible. He turned several pages, pointing to diagrams that showed intricate mechanical devices. These designs weren't inventions, they were reconstructions. Alejandro found the remains of ancient technology and spent years figuring out how to recreate it. Dr. Vasquez studied the diagrams with professional skepticism. Father, these drawings are certainly fascinating, but there's no archaeological evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations in this region, isn't there? Father Santos smiled knowingly. Tell me, Dr. Vasquez, have you examined the stone foundations that are visible during extreme low tides off the Esperanza coast? Marco saw Dr. Vasquez's expression shift to surprise. How do you know about those? Because Alejandro wrote about them extensively. Those foundations aren't Spanish colonial construction. They're much older. The settlement that was built there incorporated existing structures that were already ancient when the Spanish arrived. Father Santos unwrapped a second item from his satchel, a collection of botanical specimens preserved in glass vials. The plants appeared to be in perfect condition despite their obvious age, and several species looked unlike anything Marco had seen in local flora guides. Alejandro discovered a hidden chamber beneath the original settlement, filled with preserved specimens and cultivation instructions for plants that could thrive in conditions where normal crops would fail. He spent years learning to grow them, creating a sustainable food source for voyages that lasted far longer than conventional supply planning would allow. Isla examined the specimens with obvious excitement. Are these the same plants that would be in the ship's greenhouse, Father? Santos nodded approvingly. Very perceptive, young lady. Yes, Alejandro transplanted several varieties aboard his ship and created a growing environment that could sustain itself indefinitely. Father, Dr. Vasquez said carefully, are you suggesting that there's an intact greenhouse aboard this ship? I'm not suggesting anything, Dr. Vasquez. I'm telling you that if you follow the ship's lower passages to their logical conclusion, you'll find a chamber that has been maintaining optimal growing conditions for over 300 years. Marco felt his pulse quicken. They had explored much of the ship, but there were still areas they hadn't fully investigated, particularly in the lower levels, where the passages became narrow and difficult to navigate. Why are you telling us this now? Marco asked. If you've known about these things for 40 years, why wait until now to share them? Father Santos's expression grew serious. Because until now, there wasn't anyone with both the capability to understand what they found and the wisdom to protect it properly. Alejandro's discoveries aren't just historical curiosities. They represent knowledge that could fundamentally change human understanding of science, agriculture, and navigation. He gestured toward Dr. Vasquez's research equipment. But they could also be used by people who care more about profit than preservation, more about exploitation than understanding. As if summoned by his words, the sound of vehicles approaching across the desert reached their ears. Marco looked toward the access road and saw a convoy of black SUVs raising dust clouds as they approached the ship. That would be the corporate interests I mentioned, Dr. Vasquez said grimly. They're earlier than I expected. Father Santos showed no surprise at this development. Alejandro faced similar pressures from colonial authorities who wanted to control his discoveries. He chose to disappear rather than allow his work to be corrupted by political and economic interests. The vehicles pulled to a stop near the ship, and several people in expensive business attire began walking toward the gangway. Leading them was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she was accustomed to getting whatever she wanted. "Mr. Reyes," she called out as she approached, "I'm Victoria Chen, representing Meridian Technologies. We've been following your discoveries with great interest." Marco noticed that her company name was remarkably similar to Captain Meridia's surname, though he doubted that was a coincidence. "Ms. Chen, this is private property. You're trespassing." "Actually, Mr. Reyes, that's not entirely accurate." She produced a thick folder of documents. "We've discovered some irregularities in your inheritance claim. There are questions about your great-uncle's legal ownership of this vessel that need to be resolved before you can make any decisions about its disposition." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her academic credentials giving her voice additional authority. Ms. Chen, this ship is currently under archaeological protection as a potentially significant historical site. Any attempts to interfere with our research would constitute destruction of irreplaceable cultural artifacts. Victoria Chen smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. Dr. Vasquez, we're well aware of your research. In fact, we're prepared to offer your university substantial funding to continue that research under our sponsorship. We simply want to ensure that any commercially viable discoveries are properly developed for the benefit of humanity. Father Santos spoke quietly, but his words carried clearly across the ship's deck. The same argument was made by the Spanish Inquisition when they demanded access to Alejandro's work. They too claimed to be acting for the greater good of humanity. Ms. Chen's attention shifted to the priest with obvious irritation. Father Santos, your romantic notions about preserving the past are admirable but impractical. This discovery could revolutionize renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and precision navigation. Keeping it locked away in academic studies helps no one, and exploiting it for corporate profit helps everyone, Isla asked, her young voice cutting through the adult tension with startling directness. Marco felt a surge of protective pride as his daughter faced down the corporate representatives, without flinching. Victoria Chen seemed taken aback by the challenge from such an unexpected source. Young lady, this is a complex business discussion that affects me more than anyone, Isla interrupted. This is my dad's ship, and these are Captain Meridia's secrets, and you want to take them away just like you want to take me away from my dad. The last part of her statement surprised Marco. He hadn't realized that Isla understood the connection between their current situation and his custody battle. Victoria Chen's expression hardened. Mr. Reyes, I think you'll find that cooperating with our proposal could resolve several of your personal difficulties. We have resources that could make your life considerably easier. Are you threatening my family? I'm offering solutions to problems that don't need to become more complicated than they already are. Father Santos rose from his seat with deliberate dignity. Ms. Chen, you're repeating history with remarkable precision. Alejandro faced identical pressure from people who believed they could manage his discoveries better than he could. He chose exile over exploitation. I wonder what choice will be made here. As tensions escalated on the ship's deck, Marco noticed something that the others had missed. The preserved botanical specimens in Father Santos's collection were beginning to glow with the same golden light they'd observed in other artifacts. More significantly, similar light was starting to emanate from various points throughout the ship, as if the vessel itself was responding to the threat to its secrets. Dad, Isla whispered, tugging at his shirt. The ship is trying to tell us something. We need to listen. Marco looked at his daughter, then at the growing confrontation between preservationists and profiteers playing out on the deck of a 300-year-old mystery. Whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would determine not just his and Isla's future, but the fate of discoveries that could indeed change the world. The question was whether those changes would honor Captain Meridia's protective instincts or repeat the historical pattern of exploitation that had driven him into hiding centuries earlier. The confrontation on the ship's deck might have continued indefinitely if not for Isla's sudden gasp of excitement. Dad, look at the figurehead! Everyone turned toward the ship's bow, where the carved woman with flowing hair was beginning to glow with the same golden light they'd observed in the ship's other artifacts. But more remarkably, what they had assumed was decorative carving was revealing itself to be something far more functional. The figurehead was moving, not with the rigid animation of clockwork, but with the fluid grace of living sculpture. Her carved eyes opened, surveying the assembled group with an expression of ancient wisdom and unmistakable intelligence. Victoria Chen and her corporate representatives stepped backward in obvious alarm, while Father Santos fell to his knees, in what appeared to be reverent prayer. Dr. Vasquez stood transfixed, her scientific training warring with evidence that defied every rational explanation. But it was Marco who understood first what they were witnessing. "It's not just a ship," he breathed. "It's a living repository. Captain Meridia didn't just preserve his discoveries, he created a guardian to protect them." The figurehead turned her attention to Marco with unmistakable approval, then gestured toward a section of the ship's hull that none of them had previously noticed. What had appeared to be decorative paneling slid aside, revealing a passage that led deeper into the ship's interior than any of their previous explorations had suggested possible. "Captain Meridia's workshop," Father Santos said, rising from his knees with obvious reverence. "I've spent 40 years wondering if it really existed." Isla was already moving toward the newly revealed passage, drawn by the same intuitive connection that had guided her to previous discoveries. "It's been waiting for us," she said with absolute certainty. "All this time, it's been waiting for the right people to understand what Captain Meridia was trying to preserve." Victoria Chen regained her composure with impressive speed. "Whatever parlor tricks are being employed here, they don't change the legal realities of this situation. Mr. Reyes, you're still facing serious questions about your ownership claim." But even as she spoke, her attention was clearly focused on the newly revealed passage and its implications for her company's interests. Marco could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Whatever lay beyond that threshold could be worth far more than the $250 million they'd originally discussed. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Vasquez said firmly, "I'm invoking academic preservation protocols. This site is now under the protection of the International Archaeological Convention. Any interference with our research constitutes a violation of international law." "Dr. Vasquez, your academic protocols don't supersede private property rights or commercial interests. If Mr. Reyes chooses to partner with us, no international convention can prevent legitimate business development." Marco found himself caught between competing pressures, but his daughter's voice cut through the adult complexities with startling clarity. "Why don't we ask Captain Meridia what he wants?" Isla suggested. "If his guardian is still here, maybe he can tell us himself." Before anyone could object, Isla approached the glowing figurehead and placed her small hand against the carved wood. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire ship began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that seemed to come from the hull itself. Golden light poured from every artifact they'd discovered, creating a network of illumination that revealed the true scope of Meridia's achievement. But most remarkably, the air around the figurehead shimmered and coalesced into the translucent but unmistakable figure of a man in period clothing. Captain Alejandro Meridia himself stood before them, not quite solid, but undeniably present, his dark eyes surveying the assembled group with 3 centuries of accumulated wisdom. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from the ship itself rather than from his ghostly form. "I see that history continues to repeat itself," he said in accented but perfectly clear English. "Once again, my life's work attracts those who would exploit it and those who would preserve it." Victoria Chen's corporate composure finally cracked. "This is impossible. You're using some kind of holographic projection technology." Captain Meridia turned his attention to her with an expression of profound sadness. "Senora, I have been listening to people like you for 300 years. You see my discoveries and immediately calculate their monetary value. You never ask what they cost to achieve or what responsibilities come with possessing them." He gestured toward the revealed passage. "What lies beyond that threshold represents knowledge that could indeed transform your world. Renewable energy sources that never deplete, agricultural techniques that could end hunger, navigation methods that could open the stars themselves to human exploration." "Then why hide it?" Victoria Chen demanded. "Why not share these advances with the world?" "Because," Captain Meridia replied patiently, "sharing knowledge with those who lack wisdom to use it responsibly leads to destruction rather than progress." Your own history proves this repeatedly. Every scientific advance becomes first a weapon, then a tool of exploitation, and only finally a benefit to humanity if you are fortunate. Father Santos stepped forward with obvious reverence. Captain, I've spent my life protecting the documents that preserved your story. These people have found your ship through pure chance, but they've treated your discoveries with respect and wonder rather than greed. Captain Meridia's attention shifted to Marco and Isla, his expression softening with unmistakable approval. Indeed, the child understands what many adults cannot grasp, that true treasures must be earned through dedication and sacrifice, not simply claimed through legal documents or financial resources. He moved toward the workshop passage, his ghostly form glowing brighter with each step. Come, it is time you understood the full scope of what you have inherited, and the choices you must make. The passage beyond the threshold opened into a chamber that defied everything Marco thought he knew about the ship's construction. The workshop was enormous, far larger than the ship's external dimensions should have allowed, and filled with devices and instruments that looked like they belonged in a science fiction film rather than an 18th century vessel. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with partially completed inventions and detailed schematics. In the center of the room stood what appeared to be a prototype energy generator, its crystalline components pulsing with the same golden light they'd observed. Throughout the ship, along one wall, a series of glass chambers contained botanical specimens in various stages of cultivation, their growth systems apparently self-maintaining after centuries of operation. But most remarkably, the walls themselves were covered with star charts and mathematical calculations that seemed to describe principles of physics that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. "This is impossible," Dr. Vasquez whispered, her academic worldview struggling to process what she was seeing. "No," Captain Meridia replied gently. "It is simply improbable. There is a vast difference between the two concepts." He gestured toward the energy generator. This device converts ambient electromagnetic radiation into usable power through principles that your scientists are only beginning to understand. It has been operating continuously for 300 years, maintaining the ship's preservation systems. Victoria Chen was photographing everything with obvious excitement, already calculating the commercial applications. "Captain, surely you understand that these technologies could benefit millions of people. Keeping them hidden serves no one. Keeping them hidden has prevented them from being weaponized, monopolized, or corrupted by political interests." Captain Meridia replied firmly. "I have observed your civilization's development from this sanctuary. You have not yet learned to prioritize wisdom over cleverness, cooperation over competition." He turned to Marco with an expression of profound seriousness. "But perhaps that time is finally approaching. Your daughter possesses the kind of intuitive understanding that was common among the ancients who first developed these principles. You yourself demonstrate the careful respect that true guardianship requires. What are you asking of us? I'm offering you a choice that will determine not just your future, but the future of knowledge that could reshape human understanding of the possible. You can allow these discoveries to be exploited by those who see only their commercial value, or you can accept the responsibility of protecting them until humanity demonstrates the wisdom to use them properly." Victoria Chen stepped forward aggressively. "Mr. Reyes, don't let romantic fantasies cloud your judgment. We're offering you financial security, legal support for your custody battle, and the chance to see these technologies benefit the world." Immediately, Captain Meridia's ghostly form pulsed brighter. "And I am offering you the chance to become part of something far more significant than personal comfort or immediate gratification. The choice, as always, belongs to the living." Marco looked around the impossible workshop, at his daughter's face shining with wonder and determination, at the corporate representatives calculating profit margins, at the academics trying to reconcile evidence with theory. "Captain," he said finally, "if we accept this responsibility, what exactly would that mean for us?" "It would mean becoming the guardians of discoveries that could change everything, but only when the world is ready to change in ways that honor rather than exploit the knowledge. It would mean accepting a burden that has been mine alone for 3 centuries. Captain Meridia's form began to fade, but his voice remained strong. "Choose wisely, my friends. History is watching, and the future depends on decisions made by people like you in moments like this." As the ghostly figure disappeared, the workshop's golden light dimmed to a gentle glow, leaving Marco, Isla, and their unexpected companions standing in a chamber full of wonders and weighed down by the magnitude of the choice before them. The silence in Captain Meridia's workshop stretched for several heartbeats after his ghostly form disappeared. Marco could feel the weight of 3 centuries of hidden knowledge pressing down on him, while corporate representatives and academic researchers processed what they had witnessed with varying degrees of acceptance and skepticism. Victoria Chen was the first to recover her composure, immediately returning to the practical matters that drove her corporate mindset. "Mr. Reyes, whatever theatrical display we just witnessed doesn't change the fundamental realities of your situation," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "You're facing a custody hearing in 37 days, mounting legal bills, and the possibility of losing your daughter. We can solve all of those problems." Dr. Vasquez was examining the workshop's energy generator with obvious fascination, her scientific training warring with evidence that challenged every assumption about historical technological development. "Marco, what we're looking at here could revolutionize our understanding of physics, engineering, and historical human capabilities. This discovery needs to be studied, documented, and preserved properly." Father Santos remained focused on the larger implications. Captain Meridia spent 3 centuries protecting this knowledge from exploitation. The question isn't whether these discoveries should be preserved, but whether they should be released into a world that hasn't demonstrated the wisdom to use them responsibly. But it was Isla who cut through the adult complexities with the kind of direct perception that had guided them to each discovery. "Dad, you're thinking too hard about this," she said, running her small hands over one of the workshop's mysterious devices. "Captain Meridia didn't choose us randomly. He's been waiting for people who would understand what really matters." Marco knelt beside his daughter, trying to see the situation through her clearer perspective. "What do you think really matters, Mija? Not the money, not even the science stuff. What matters is that someone finally found Captain Meridia's treasures, who won't use them to hurt people or make themselves more important than everyone else." The simplicity of her observations struck Marco with the force of revelation. All the complex arguments about commercial development, academic research, and historical preservation were missing the fundamental point. Captain Meridia had preserved these discoveries for people who would protect them for the right reasons, not exploit them for personal gain. Victoria Chen clearly sensed that she was losing her audience to philosophical considerations rather than practical ones. "Mr. Reyes, I need you to understand something. Word of this discovery is already spreading through certain channels. Within 48 hours, you'll have treasure hunters, government agencies, and international corporations descending on this site. Working with us now gives you some control over that process. Refusing our partnership leaves you vulnerable to forces you can't possibly manage alone." Her warning carried the ring of truth, but it also revealed the fundamental problem with her approach. She was offering to protect Marco from the consequences of exactly the kind of exploitation she represented. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her examination of the energy generator. "Marco, there might be a third option we haven't considered. What if we could establish this site as an international research preserve, protected by academic institutions, but open to careful, controlled study? Under whose authority?" "Victoria, Chen demanded. "You can't simply declare a private property site to be under international protection." "Actually," Father Santos said quietly, "there might be historical precedents that could apply here. The original Spanish land grants for this area were never properly transferred under United States territorial law. Captain Meridia's settlement predates all subsequent claims." Marco felt a spark of hope. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the ship and the land it sits on might not be subject to current property law at all. If Captain Meridia's original settlement can be documented as a continuous presence, it could be classified as a sovereign historical preserve." Victoria Chen's expression darkened with obvious frustration. "Father Santos, you're talking about legal technicalities that could take years to resolve in court. Mr. Reyes doesn't have years, he has weeks before his custody hearing." But even as the corporate representative pressed her case, Marco noticed something that the others had missed. Throughout their conversation, the workshop's energy generator had been gradually increasing its output. The golden light that emanated from its crystalline components was growing brighter, and new sections of the chamber were becoming illuminated. "Look," he said, pointing toward a previously dark corner of the workshop where light was revealing another workbench covered with documents and mechanical devices. The newly illuminated area contained what appeared to be Captain Meridia's final project, a device that combined elements of all his previous inventions into something that looked both beautiful and impossibly complex. At its center was a bound manuscript that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Isla approached the device with the fearless curiosity that had guided all their discoveries. "It's another message from Captain Meridia," she announced after examining the glowing manuscript. "But this one is different. It's like he knew exactly what we would need to know." Dr. Vasquez joined her at the workbench, carefully opening the manuscript to reveal pages covered with diagrams, calculations, and text written in multiple languages. "This appears to be a comprehensive guide to all his discoveries, including detailed instructions for their construction and application." "The Meridia Codex," Father Santos breathed with obvious reverence. "Carlos Herrera spent decades searching for evidence that it existed." Marco studied the manuscript over Dr. Vasquez's shoulder, noting that many of the diagrams showed devices far more advanced than anything they'd discovered so far. It's not just a record of what he'd already built, it's a blueprint for technologies he hadn't finished developing. Victoria Chen pushed closer to examine the codex, her corporate instincts immediately recognizing its significance. "Mr. Reyes, this document alone could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the right research and development companies. The renewable energy applications alone could transform entire industries." But as she spoke, the manuscript began to react to her proximity in ways that clearly weren't positive. The pages started to darken, and the device containing them emitted a low, warning tone that seemed to emanate from the ship's hull itself. "It doesn't like her," Isla observed matter-of-factly. "Captain Meridia built protections into his most important discoveries. They won't work for people who want to use them for the wrong reasons." Father Santos nodded with understanding. Alejandro spent years studying the wisdom traditions of indigenous peoples who had learned to integrate advanced knowledge with spiritual responsibility. His final inventions weren't just technological, they were designed to respond to the intentions and character of those who used them. Dr. Vasquez was making rapid notes, her academic mind struggling to process the implications. "You're suggesting that these devices somehow evaluate the moral character of users?" "I'm suggesting that Captain Meridia understood something that modern science has forgotten, that consciousness and technology are inevitably linked, and that truly advanced civilizations must develop both simultaneously." The workshop's energy generator pulsed brighter, and throughout the ship, other artifacts began responding with increased activity. The crystalline navigation stone in the compass room sang with ethereal harmony. The mechanical star chart calculator hummed with computational power. and the botanical specimens glowed with vibrant life force. Marco realized that the ship itself was preparing for something, not just responding to their presence, but actively coordinating its various systems for a purpose that was becoming increasingly clear. "It's not just a repository," he said with growing understanding. "It's a test. Captain Meridia designed everything to evaluate whether we're worthy of inheriting his discoveries." Isla nodded with the kind of certainty that had characterized all her insights. "And we're almost at the final test. But first, we have to make the choice about what we really want, the treasures or the responsibility that comes with them." Victoria Chen's patience finally reached its breaking point. "This is ridiculous. You're allowing a child's fantasies and an old priest's superstitions to cloud your judgment about a discovery that could change the world." She pulled out her phone and began making a call. "I'm activating our contingency protocols. If you won't cooperate voluntarily, we have other methods for securing access to these discoveries." But before she could complete her call, the ship's bell began tolling with deep, resonant notes that seemed to echo from the desert hills themselves. The sound was neither mournful nor celebratory. It was a summons, calling forth whatever final revelation Captain Meridia had prepared for this moment. Father Santos smiled with profound satisfaction. "It appears that the time for choosing has arrived. Captain Meridia is ready to reveal his ultimate secret, but only to those who have proven themselves worthy of receiving it." The workshop's energy generator reached a crescendo of activity, and throughout the ship, every artifact they had discovered began glowing with harmonized golden light. The very air seemed to vibrate with potential energy as Captain Meridia's centuries-old preparations finally approached their intended culmination. Marco looked at his daughter, standing fearlessly beside impossible technologies that responded to her touch with obvious affection. He thought of the custody hearing that loomed just weeks away, of the financial pressures that had been crushing him for months, of the simple desire to give Isla a stable, secure future. But he also thought of Captain Meridia, who had chosen exile and centuries of waiting rather than allow his discoveries to be corrupted by those who lacked the wisdom to use them properly. He thought of the ship's patient preservation of wonders that could indeed transform the world, if that world proved ready for transformation. "Dr. Vasquez," he said finally, "if we established this site as a research preserve, who would control access to Captain Meridia's discoveries?" "A consortium of international academic institutions with oversight from cultural preservation organizations. The goal would be careful study and gradual, responsible development of the technologies." Victoria Chen ended her phone call with obvious satisfaction. "Mr. Reyes, I'm afraid you're running out of time to make this decision voluntarily. My company has been in communication with Child Protective Services regarding the safety concerns of involving a minor in an uncontrolled archaeological situation." Marco felt ice form in his stomach. "Are you threatening to have Isla taken away?" "I'm pointing out that courts tend to view parents who expose their children to potentially dangerous situations as demonstrating poor judgment. Of course, parents who cooperate with proper corporate oversight of valuable discoveries tend to be viewed more favorably by family court judges." The threat was elegantly constructed and utterly ruthless. Marco could see exactly how it would play in court. A struggling single father who had dragged his daughter into a chaotic treasure hunt involving unverified artifacts and questionable academic claims. But even as corporate pressure mounted and legal threats materialized, the ship itself seemed to be building toward some kind of climax. The Meridia Codex was glowing brighter, its pages turning of their own accord to reveal new diagrams and calculations. The workshop's various devices were coordinating their activities in ways that suggested a greater purpose than individual function. Isla walked calmly to the center of the workshop, where the energy generator's crystalline components were now pulsing in perfect synchronization with the ship's bell. "Dad, Captain Meridia is ready to show us his most important secret," But first, we have to prove we understand what he was really trying to protect. What do you mean, Mija? He wasn't just hiding inventions. He was preserving the idea that knowledge and responsibility go together, that real treasures can't be stolen or bought, they can only be earned. Father Santos approached the glowing codex with reverent care. Alejandro's final lesson. After 3 centuries, he's ready to trust someone with the complete truth of what he discovered. The manuscript's pages settled on a diagram that showed not just a single device, but an integrated system that combined all of Captain Meridia's individual inventions into something far greater than the sum of its parts. At its center was a mechanism that Marco hadn't seen before, something that looked like a combination of clockwork precision and crystalline energy generation. It's a time lock, Dr. Vasquez realized, studying the diagram with growing excitement. Not just a security device, but an actual temporal mechanism. Captain Meridia designed a system that would only activate when specific conditions were met. What? A kind of conditions? The presence of people who would choose preservation over exploitation, wisdom over mere cleverness. The ship has been evaluating us since the moment we first stepped aboard. Victoria Chen's corporate reinforcements arrived at that moment. Additional vehicles carrying legal representatives and what appeared to be private security personnel. But as they approached the ship, something remarkable happened. The vessel's preservation systems activated in ways that none of them had witnessed before. A shimmering barrier of energy surrounded the ship, not threatening or aggressive, but absolutely impermeable. The corporate team found themselves unable to approach. Closer than 50 feet from the hull, Alejandro's ultimate protection, Father Santos explained, with obvious satisfaction. The ship can defend itself when necessary, but only against those who would harm what it protects. Inside the energy barrier, the workshop's time lock mechanism was finally revealing its purpose. The crystalline components were aligning in a configuration that generated not just light, but what appeared to be images, holographic projections that showed Captain Meridia himself in his final days aboard. The ship, the images revealed the truth of his disappearance. He hadn't fled from colonial authorities or simply vanished into history. He had used his own discoveries to step outside of normal temporal flow, preserving himself and his knowledge in a state that existed between moments, waiting for the right people to inherit what he had spent his life protecting. He's still here, Isla said with wonder, watching the holographic images show Captain Meridia working at the same benches they now stood beside. He never really left. He's been waiting inside the ship's time lock for 300 years. The implications struck Marco with stunning force. Captain Meridia hadn't just preserved his inventions, he had preserved himself, accepting a kind of temporal exile that allowed him to personally guard his discoveries until the right guardians finally appeared. The time lock mechanism pulsed brighter, and suddenly Captain Meridia's ghostly form materialized not as a projection, but as a fully present consciousness, his dark eyes bright with 3 centuries of accumulated patience. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "the time has come for me to pass the guardianship of these discoveries to those who understand their true purpose. But first, you must make the final choice, not just for yourselves, but for the future of knowledge in your world." Outside the ship's protective barrier, Victoria Chen and her team were clearly frustrated by their inability to approach, but Marco could see them regrouping for whatever their next strategy might involve. The custody hearing was still weeks away, but the corporate forces arrayed against them were already demonstrating their power to manipulate legal and social systems. "Captain," Marco said, looking from Isla's expectant face to the impossible. "Technologies surrounding them. What exactly are you asking us to choose?" Captain Meridia's presence filled the workshop with an energy that was both ancient and timeless. His form was more solid now than it had been before, as if the activation of the time lock mechanism had restored his connection to the physical world. "Marco Reyes," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent centuries considering every word, "I am asking you to choose between personal security and universal responsibility, between immediate comfort and long-term wisdom." He gestured toward the barrier of energy that surrounded the ship, where Victoria Chen's corporate team was setting up what appeared to be sophisticated scanning equipment. "Those people represent the same forces that drove me into exile 3 centuries ago. They see knowledge as property to be owned, wisdom as commodity to be exploited." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her academic training warring with the impossible reality of conversing with a man who had been dead for hundreds of years. "Captain, surely you understand that keeping these discoveries hidden serves no one. The technologies you've developed could solve global energy crises, revolutionize agriculture, advance human exploration of space itself." "Dr. Vasquez," Captain Meridia replied patiently, "those same arguments were made by colonial authorities who demanded access to my work. They promised that my discoveries would be used for the betterment of humanity. Instead, they wanted to turn my navigation systems into tools of conquest, my energy generation into weapons of war." He moved toward the time lock mechanism, his ghostly hands manipulating controls that responded as if he were still fully alive. "I have observed your civilization's development from within this temporal sanctuary. You have made remarkable advances in knowledge, but you have not learned to prioritize wisdom over cleverness, cooperation over domination." The mechanism's crystalline components began to rearrange themselves in new configurations, and the workshop's various devices responded. With increasing activity, Marco could feel energy building throughout the ship, not threatening but purposeful, as if Captain Meridia was preparing to demonstrate something that would clarify all their choices. "However," the captain continued, his expression brightening, as he looked at Isla, "your daughter represents something I have not encountered in 3 centuries of observation, a mind that instinctively understands the relationship between knowledge and responsibility." Isla approached the time lock mechanism without hesitation, her small hands finding controls that seemed designed for her touch. As she interacted with the device, new sections of the workshop began to illuminate, revealing technologies even more advanced than those they had already discovered. "Captain Meridia," she said, with the directness that characterized all her observations, "you're not just choosing guardians for your inventions, you're choosing teachers for the future." The captain's face lit up with obvious delight. "Precisely, young lady. The question is not whether humanity deserves access to these discoveries, but whether humanity is ready to learn the wisdom necessary to use them properly." Father Santos had been quietly observing the interaction, but now he spoke with the certainty of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "Alejandro, the world has changed since your time. There are institutions now, universities, international organizations, preservation societies that could protect and gradually share your discoveries responsibly. And there are also corporations, governments, and military organizations that would corrupt those discoveries faster than they could be protected," Captain Meridia replied. "The fundamental challenge remains the same as it was in my era: how to ensure that advanced knowledge serves wisdom rather than replacing it." Outside the ship's protective barrier, Victoria Chen was clearly losing patience with the delay. Marco could see her team setting up more sophisticated equipment, and he noticed additional vehicles approaching in the distance. Whatever corporate resources she commanded were being mobilized for a comprehensive assault on the ship's defenses. But inside the barrier, the time lock mechanism was reaching its final configuration. The crystalline components aligned in a pattern that generated not just light, but a kind of harmonic resonance that seemed to connect every artifact they had discovered throughout the ship. "The moment of choice has arrived," Captain Meridia announced, his form beginning to glow with the same golden light as his inventions. The time lock is ready to release its final secret, the discovery that represents the culmination of everything I learned during my voyages. He gestured toward a section of the workshop wall that was beginning to slide away, revealing a chamber that Marco hadn't realized existed. Inside, surrounded by preservation fields that shimmered like aurora, stood a device that dwarfed everything they had seen before. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a crystalline structure perhaps 20 feet in height, surrounded by rings of exotic metals and filled with components that seemed to bend light around their edges. Energy patterns flowed through its structure like liquid starlight, and the very air around it seemed to vibrate with potential. "What is it?" Dr. Vasquez breathed, her scientific training completely overwhelmed by what she was witnessing. "It is the source of everything," Captain Meridia replied simply. "The device that allowed me to transcend the limitations of my era, to preserve knowledge across centuries, to create technologies that exist in harmony with natural law rather than in opposition to it." He turned to Marco with an expression of profound seriousness. "But it is also the most dangerous discovery ever made by human hands. In the wrong hands, it could unravel the very foundations of reality. In the right hands, it could guide humanity toward a future of unlimited possibility." The corporate scanning equipment outside the barrier suddenly activated with blinding intensity, and Marco realized that Victoria Chen's team had identified the energy signature of Captain Meridia's ultimate device. Whatever they had brought with them was powerful enough to penetrate the ship's defenses, at least partially. "Choose quickly, my friend," Captain Meridia urged. "They have detected the temporal resonance. Soon, the choice will be made for you." Marco looked at his daughter, standing fearlessly beside impossible technologies, her small hand resting on controls that had waited 3 centuries for her touch. He thought of the custody hearing, of Sarah's accusations about his impractical dreams, of Victoria Chen's threats and promises, but mostly he thought of Captain Meridia, who had chosen exile over exploitation, who had accepted centuries of solitude to protect discoveries that could transform the world, if that world proved worthy of transformation. "Captain," Marco said finally, "I choose responsibility over security. I choose guardianship over ownership." Isla smiled with radiant approval. "I knew you would, Dad. That's why the ship chose us." Captain Meridia's form blazed brighter with obvious satisfaction. "Then let the legacy transfer commence." He approached the massive crystalline device and began activating controls that seemed to respond to his intentions rather than physical manipulation. The entire ship resonated with harmonious energy as systems that had been dormant for centuries came fully online. Outside the protective barrier, Victoria Chen's equipment detected the increasing energy output and responded with more aggressive, scanning attempts. But as the corporate team intensified their assault on the ship's defenses, something unexpected happened. The barrier didn't weaken. It expanded, pushing Chen's team farther back, while simultaneously revealing the ship's true nature to anyone watching. What had appeared to be a weathered historical relic transformed into something that defied every assumption about period technology. The hull gleamed with the same golden light as the artifacts within, and intricate patterns of energy flowed across its surface like living circuitry. The masts and rigging began moving with purpose, adjusting configurations that had nothing to do with catching wind and everything to do with channeling cosmic forces. The ship itself is the ultimate artifact, Dr. Vasquez realized, watching the transformation with academic fascination and personal awe. Not just a vessel that carries discoveries, but a discovery that happens to be shaped like a vessel. Captain Meridia nodded approvingly. The San Esperanza was never just a ship. It was a prototype, a proof of concept for technologies that could allow humanity to explore not just the oceans of this world, but the cosmic currents that flow between stars themselves. The crystalline device at the chamber's center pulsed with increasing intensity, and throughout the ship, every artifact they had discovered began singing in harmonic resonance. The effect was overwhelmingly beautiful, like listening to a choir of angels performing mathematics. But it was also overwhelmingly powerful. Marco could feel the device's energy interacting with fundamental forces, manipulating space and time in ways that made his diving experience feel like splashing in a bathtub. "Captain," Father Santos said with reverent concern, "the corporate forces outside are bringing more equipment, military vehicles by the look of them. Whatever you're planning to do, it needs to happen quickly." Captain Meridia's expression grew serious. "They have detected the temporal resonance field. Once fully activated, this device could indeed threaten the foundations of local reality if misused. They are right to be concerned, but wrong to believe they can control it." The ship's protective barrier began fluctuating under the increasing assault from outside. Victoria Chen's team had been joined by what appeared to be government agents, and their scanning equipment was beginning to penetrate the energy field. "Dad," Isla said urgently, "Captain Meridia needs us to help him complete the legacy transfer. But once we do, we'll be connected to his discoveries forever. We can't go back to just being normal people who don't know these secrets." Marco understood the implications. Accepting guardianship of Captain Meridia's legacy would mean accepting responsibility for knowledge that could change the world, or destroy it. There would be no quiet retirement, no simple custody arrangements, no ordinary future for him and Isla. But there would also be no regrets about failing to protect something truly extraordinary from those who would corrupt it. "I understand, Mija. Are you ready?" Isla nodded with the kind of certainty that had guided them through every discovery. "I've been ready since the first time I touched the ship's bell." Together, father and daughter placed their hands on the crystalline device's control interface. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not just energy, but information, flowing into their minds with the force of revelation. Marco suddenly understood everything, the mathematical principles behind Captain Meridia's technologies, the cosmic forces they manipulated, the reasons why such knowledge required wisdom rather than mere intelligence to use safely. It was like being connected to the mind of the universe itself, but more importantly, he understood the responsibility they were accepting. The knowledge came with built-in safeguards. It could only be used by those who genuinely sought to protect and preserve rather than exploit and dominate. The legacy transfer reached completion, just as Victoria Chen's team finally breached the ship's protective barrier. Corporate security forces and government agents poured onto the deck, only to find themselves in a vessel that no longer quite existed in normal space-time. Captain Meridia's form solidified completely as the temporal locks released their hold on his consciousness. For the first time in 3 centuries, he was fully present in the physical world. "Welcome to the San Esperanza, ladies and gentlemen," he said to the intruders with perfect politeness. "I am Captain Alejandro Meridia, and this vessel is now under the protection of its rightful guardians." Victoria Chen stared at him with obvious disbelief. "This is impossible. You died 300 years ago." "I chose temporal exile 300 years ago," Captain Meridia corrected gently. "There is a significant difference between the two concepts." The ship's energy systems reached full activation, and the impossible happened. The entire vessel began to rise from the desert floor, supported not by conventional technology, but by forces that made gravity optional. As the San Esperanza lifted into the evening sky, Marco realized that their choice had consequences far beyond what any of them had imagined. They weren't just protecting Captain Meridia's discoveries. They were preparing to embark on adventures that would redefine human understanding of the possible. 6 months after the San Esperanza first rose from the California desert, the ship had settled into what could only be described as a carefully managed compromise with the modern world. Rather than disappearing entirely into cosmic exploration, Captain Meridia had chosen to establish the vessel as something unprecedented, a floating research institute that existed partially outside normal space-time but remained accessible to carefully selected scholars and scientists. The ship now rested in a protected cove along the Big Sur coastline, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that complemented its otherworldly technologies. From the outside, it appeared to be a magnificently restored historical galleon. But those who boarded with the proper intentions and clearances discovered chambers filled with wonders that redefined human understanding of science, history, and possibility. Marco stood on the ship's deck, watching Isla work with Dr. Vasquez and a team of international researchers who had been carefully chosen for their combination of brilliant minds and ethical foundations. His daughter moved among the ship's artifacts with the easy familiarity of someone who had grown up understanding that the impossible was simply another word for not yet understood. "Dad, the botanical preservation system wants to show us something." "New today," Isla announced, looking up from a chart she'd been studying with one of the visiting marine biologists. At 9 years old, she had become something of a wonder herself, not just for her intuitive grasp of Captain Meridia's technologies, but for her ability to explain complex concepts to adults who sometimes struggled with ideas that came naturally. To her, the custody hearing had been resolved in ways that nobody could have predicted. When Sarah arrived for what she expected to be a straightforward legal proceeding, she found herself instead confronted with evidence that her daughter and ex-husband had become guardians of discoveries that were attracting attention from universities, governments, and international preservation organizations around the world. The judge, faced with testimony from respected academics, documentation from historical societies, and what appeared to be genuine artifacts of incalculable cultural value, had ruled that Isla's interests were best served by remaining with the parent who could provide her with educational opportunities that no conventional school could match. Sarah herself had undergone a transformation that surprised everyone, including herself. Initially skeptical of what she assumed were Marco's latest impractical schemes, she had gradually come to understand that their daughter was involved in something genuinely extraordinary. She now visited the ship regularly, contributing her practical organizational skills to help manage the complex logistics of running an international research facility that existed partially outside normal reality. "She's remarkable," Dr. Vasquez said, joining Marco at the ship's railing. "I've worked with graduate students who don't grasp theoretical concepts as quickly as Isla understands Captain Meridia's technologies." Marco smiled, watching his daughter. "Explain something about temporal mechanics to a physicist from Cambridge. Captain Meridia says she has what he calls native wisdom, the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be taught because it recognizes truth intuitively. And what about you? Any regrets about choosing guardianship over a simpler life?" Marco considered the question while observing the controlled chaos of research activity around them. The ship hosted a rotating community of perhaps 30 people. At any given time, scientists, historians, artists, and philosophers who had been invited to study Captain Meridia's discoveries in exchange for committing to use their knowledge responsibly. "There are moments when I wonder what our lives would have been like if I'd taken Victoria Chen's offer," he admitted. "Financial security, conventional custody arrangements, a normal future for Isla. But normal futures don't include watching. Your daughter helped design renewable energy systems that could power entire cities without environmental impact. Normal futures don't include conversations with a 300-year-old genius who treats you as an equal colleague. Normal futures don't include the knowledge that you're helping to preserve discoveries that could guide humanity toward its full potential. Dr. Vasquez nodded with understanding. The Meridian Foundation has received inquiries from every major university in the world. Everyone wants access to what we're learning here. The Meridian Foundation had been Marco's solution to the problem of managing Captain Meridia's legacy responsibly. Rather than allowing governments or corporations to control access to the discoveries, the Foundation operated as an independent international organization dedicated to gradual, ethical development of the technologies. Captain Meridia himself served as the Foundation's primary consultant, though his approach to sharing knowledge remained carefully measured. Each technology was released to the world only when he judged that humanity had developed sufficient wisdom to use it properly. "Any word on the energy grid project?" Marco asked. "The prototype installations are exceeding all performance expectations. Clean, unlimited power generation with no environmental impact and no risk of weaponization." "It's exactly what Captain Meridia promised. Technology that serves wisdom rather than replacing it." The ship's bell chimed softly, its resonant tone signaling the approach of evening. Around the world, similar installations based on Captain Meridia's discoveries were beginning to transform human understanding of what was possible when science and ethics developed together. Father Santos emerged from the ship's library, where he had been working with historians to document Captain Meridia's complete story. At 83, the priest had found new purpose in helping to preserve the spiritual dimensions of discoveries that transcended mere technological advancement. "Marco, Captain Meridia would like to see you and Isla in his workshop. He says it's time for the next phase of your education." Marco found the captain in the ship's expanded workshop, surrounded by devices that seemed to grow more sophisticated each time he visited. Captain Meridia had explained that the ship itself was constantly evolving, developing new capabilities as its guardians proved themselves worthy of greater responsibilities. "My friend," Captain Meridia said, looking up from a holographic display that showed star charts of impossible complexity, "it has been 6 months since you accepted guardianship of these discoveries. The foundation is established, the research protocols are working, and humanity has demonstrated the ability to use at least some of my technologies responsibly." "That sounds like the beginning of a larger conversation," Marco replied. Captain Meridia smiled with the kind of anticipation that suggested new adventures were approaching. "Indeed it is. The discoveries you have helped to preserve represent only a fraction of what is possible when consciousness and technology develop in harmony. There are other repositories, other guardians, other civilizations that have learned to balance knowledge with wisdom." Isla joined them in the workshop, her eyes bright with excitement. "Captain Meridia wants to show us the navigation charts for deep space exploration. He says humanity is almost ready to meet its cosmic neighbors." Marco looked at his daughter, then at the man who had waited 3 centuries for the right guardians to appear, then at the impossible technologies that surrounded them. 6 months ago, he had been a struggling single father facing the possibility of losing custody of his daughter. Now he was a guardian of knowledge that could reshape human civilization, father to a child whose understanding of the universe expanded daily, and partner to a ghost who had become more real than most living people he'd known. The future stretched ahead of them like an ocean of possibility, and for the first time in years, Marco couldn't wait to explore it. Outside the workshop windows, the Pacific Ocean reflected the light of stars that were no longer impossibly distant destinations, but potential harbors for a ship that had learned to sail through time itself. The San Esperanza had indeed guarded its secrets well, but as Captain Meridia had always intended, the greatest treasure wasn't the knowledge itself. It was the wisdom to use that knowledge in service of dreams larger than individual ambition. Some treasures, Marco had learned, were indeed worth waiting 3 centuries to find.